Hey guys, tonight we're going to drift into one of those topics that feels both oddly cozy and just a little unsettling. Don't worry, there won't be any jump scares or anything like that. This is still bedtime history. But we're going to explore the kind of fear that shaped the personal lives of kings, queens, emperors, and all the assorted royal disasters that Europe kept breeding like rabbits. Fear, after all, was the real invisible crown. It's what kept monarchs awake at night, clutching their rosaries, glancing nervously at servants who might be plotting against them, and obsessing over omens in their dreams. Fear wasn't always about armies or uprisings either. Sometimes it was just the looming shadow of genetic decline, family curses, or that nagging feeling that everyone in the court hated you, which, honestly, they usually did. So, tonight we're going to float through some of the most fear-ridden royals in European history. Not the mighty conquerors who charged into battle without blinking, but the anxious, the paranoid, the sickly, the ones who reigned in spite of, or maybe because of, their perpetual sense of dread. Let's start by tucking ourselves into the 16th century, where fear and power went hand in hand like a badly arranged dynastic marriage. Charles VI of France, the mad king who saw ghosts. Charles VI of France, sometimes optimistically called Charles the Beloved, but more often remembered as Charles the Mad. His reign began with promise, but within a few years, it spiraled into a masterclass in royal paranoia. Charles developed what modern historians politely call psychotic episodes. To everyone else, he was just terrifying. He believed he was made of glass, not metaphorically, but literally. As in, he wore reinforced clothing because he was convinced that if someone bumped into him, his body would shatter like a wine goblet. That is a real royal policy of fear. Imagine trying to host court when your king insists you stand 6 feet away at all times because he's worried about splintering into shards. He even had iron rods sewn into his clothing to keep himself safe. That's not exactly a vibe of confident leadership. And then there were the ghosts. Charles sometimes refused to bathe or change clothes because he was certain assassins were waiting in the shadows. He would run through the corridors of his palaces, screaming, convinced that unseen enemies were closing in. To be fair, he wasn't entirely wrong to feel unsafe. France at the time was basically one prolonged bar fight between the Armagnacs and the Burgundians. But his own fear turned into policy paralysis. His courtiers lived in constant dread too, not of enemies, but of Charles himself. During one infamous episode, Charles drew his sword during a parade and attacked his own men, killing several before he was subdued. It wasn't rebellion that people feared anymore, it was being in the same room as their monarch. So yes, Charles VI left behind a legacy of royal paranoia so intense that people started quietly planning for leadership without him. His fear was contagious, spreading through the court like a bad cold. Philip II of Spain, the paranoid bureaucrat. Now let's float gently south to Spain. Philip II, the king who had more titles than hobbies, might be the most overworked micromanager in history. He wasn't insane like Charles VI, but fear shaped his entire reign. He was terrified of losing control. His father, Charles V, had been the flashy conqueror type, running around Europe and the Americas like an imperial rock star. Philip? He was more of a stay-at-home monarch. He basically locked himself in the gloomy halls of El Escorial, a palace that looks less like a royal home than an insurance company headquarters, and tried to control his sprawling empire through endless paperwork. Seriously, he read and annotated everything. Ministers would submit proposals, and instead of delegating like a normal king, Philip would insist on reviewing each minor detail.
He was so paranoid that if a governor suggested one plan, Philip would send it back with 47 margin notes, as if the fate of empire rested on whether a tax was collected in silver coins or gold coins. His paranoia also extended to religion. Philip was haunted by the fear of heresy, which for him meant Protestants hiding under every bed. He spent years orchestrating the Inquisition's efforts, convinced that God had personally assigned him the role of Catholic hall monitor. And then there was England. Poor Philip had the misfortune of being married to Queen Mary I, Bloody Mary herself. When she died childless, Philip's dynastic dream evaporated. He was left stewing with the fear that Protestant England would always remain outside his grasp. Hence the Armada in 1588, which he sent out like a floating security blanket, only to watch it sink, literally and figuratively. Philip's sense of fear wasn't theatrical like Charles VI, but it was the slow, grinding paranoia of a man who believed the entire weight of empire would collapse if he didn't personally sign off on every sheet of paper. Imagine being his secretary. Ivan the Terrible. Fear as a lifestyle. Now let's drift east into Russia, where fear practically became a form of governance. Ivan IV, better known as Ivan the Terrible, had the unique distinction of being both deeply afraid and utterly terrifying. Ivan grew up surrounded by betrayal. His father died young, his mother may have been poisoned, and as a child he watched the boyar nobles treat him like an inconvenient orphan. He never really got over it, so when he finally claimed power, Ivan decided to make fear the official national currency. He created the Oprichnina, his own private terror squad dressed in black, riding black horses with dog heads strapped to their saddles to symbolize their loyalty. That's not exactly subtle. Ivan sent them to purge anyone he suspected of treason, which was basically everyone. But here's the twist. Ivan himself lived in fear too. He was convinced of constant betrayal, haunted by omens, and obsessed with the idea that God might punish him at any moment. His violent outbursts, like when he killed his own son in a fit of rage, weren't signs of confidence, but of a man so consumed by dread that he lashed out at shadows. The Russian people didn't love him, but they feared him. And that was enough for Ivan, or at least until Russia was left in ruins after his reign. His sense of fear was both personal trauma and public policy. A pause to breathe. Let's take a moment. We've drifted from glass-bodied French kings to Spanish control freaks, and now into the shadowy paranoia of Russia. If there's one theme here, it's that fear and power were never separate for monarchs. Being at the top didn't mean freedom from fear. It usually meant doubling down on it. But don't worry, we're not about to get into dramatic cliffhangers or violent descriptions. We're going to keep floating along, nice and steady, into a few more royals whose lives were ruled not by bravery, but by nerves, anxiety, and a very human sense of dread. In our next stretch, we'll wander into the Habsburgs, because of course we will. And if you know anything about them, you already know that their entire dynasty was basically one long anxiety dream.